The carriage wheel snapped in half on the muddy road, and Alina Marsh was thrown against the door with her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The driver shouted something about the axle. Rain came down like it had a personal grudge against her. She had exactly 4 coins left in her pocket, a letter of employment that might already be worthless, and no idea that in less than an hour she would be standing face to face with a man the entire county had been warned never to approach. She climbed out into the mud because staying in a broken carriage seemed worse than walking. The driver refused to go further. He said the last stretch of road belonged to Rothmere land, and no coachman in the district would drive it after dark. Alina asked him why. He would not answer. He only pointed toward a gate half swallowed by fog and drove his horse away as fast as the animal could manage, leaving her alone with her trunk and the letter that said she was expected at Rothmere Hall by nightfall. She had taken the position out of desperation, not choice. Her father's debts had eaten through everything her family owned, and the agency in London had promised good wages for a household accountant willing to work somewhere quiet. They had not mentioned that quiet meant feared. They had not mentioned the Duke at all. By the time she reached the iron gates, her boots were ruined and her hands had gone numb. A groundskeeper found her there, staring up at a house so large it looked like it had grown out of the hill rather than been built on it. He did not smile at her. He did not welcome her. He simply asked one question. "Has anyone told you about the master?" Alina said no. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone standing too close to a cliff edge. "Then I suppose you'll learn on your own." The housekeeper who opened the servant's door was a narrow woman named Margaret Doyle, with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She looked Alina over once, decided she was not worth much conversation, and led her through a maze of cold corridors without offering to help carry her trunk. "You'll take your meals in the small dining room," Margaret said. "You will not go near the east wing. You will not speak unless spoken to at dinner, and at dinner you will keep your eyes on your plate." Alina, still shivering from the rain, asked why. Margaret stopped walking. She turned around slowly, and for the first time there was something other than coldness in her face. There was fear. "Because the Duke does not like to be looked at," she said, "and because looking at him has cost people things they could not get back." Alina wanted to ask what that meant, but Margaret was already walking again, faster now, as if she regretted saying anything at all. The room they gave her was small but clean, tucked at the end of a corridor that smelled of dust and old wood polish. She unpacked what little she had and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the house creak around her. Somewhere far off, a door closed with a sound so heavy it seemed to shake the floor. She told herself it was only the wind. She did not entirely believe it. Dinner that first night was meant to be simple. She was told to eat in the small dining room, alone, away from the family. But a mix-up over the seating arrangement, one Margaret would later blame on a new footman, placed Alina in the main dining hall instead, at a table far too grand for a single woman with mud still dried into the hem of her dress. She realized the mistake only when the door opened, and a man walked in who filled the doorway the way a storm fills a sky. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in black that had clearly once been tailored with care and was now worn out of habit rather than pride. The left side of his face caught the candlelight strangely, the skin there pulled tight and pale in a way that told its own story without a single word being spoken. His left hand, when it came into view, moved differently than his right, stiffer, more careful. Every servant in the room stopped moving. A maid near the sideboard actually stepped backward, as if putting distance between herself and him was an instinct she couldn't fight even after years in his service. He noticed Alina immediately. Of course he did. She was sitting in a place she had no business sitting, dressed like she had walked through a storm, which she had, and staring directly at him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of someone who had not yet been taught to be afraid. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned to keep everything about himself contained. "Alina Marsh," she said, "I believe there has been a mistake with the seating." "There has," he agreed. His eyes, dark and sharp, moved over her the way a man reads a page he expects to find boring and instead finds strange. "You're the new accountant." "I am. You're supposed to be afraid of me." It was said so plainly, so without any attempt to soften it, that Alina almost laughed. She caught herself before she did, because laughing at a duke on her first night in his house seemed like a fast way to lose a job she desperately needed. "I've been traveling since dawn," she said instead. "My carriage broke an axle a mile from your gate. I walked the rest of the way in the rain. I don't have much left in me tonight for being afraid of anything, my lord, including you." For one long moment, nothing happened. The servants along the wall seemed to hold a collective breath, waiting for the temper the house whispered about, the fire behind his eyes that people said had taken his wife and half his own face with it. Instead, something flickered across his expression that Alina would spend weeks trying to name. It might have been surprise. It might have been the beginning of something else entirely. "Margaret," he said, not looking away from Alina, "see that Miss Marsh gets a proper meal. And dry clothes." Margaret, standing frozen near the door, managed only a stiff nod. He turned and walked out without eating a single bite of the meal set for him, his uneven footsteps fatting down the corridor, toward the part of the house Alina had already been warned never to enter. Later that night, lying in her narrow bed with dry clothes finally on her back and a full stomach for the first time in 2 days, Alina replayed the moment over and over. She thought about the way every servant in that room had flinched at his presence, the way Margaret's hands had trembled slightly as she poured water, the way the maids would not lift their eyes from the floor. She thought about the scars on his face and hand, and the story that must live behind them, a story no one in the house seemed willing to tell. She thought, most of all, about the flicker in his eyes when she had not looked away. The next morning, she was given a tour of the estate offices by an elderly clerk named Walter Higgins, a kind but nervous man who jumped every time a door slammed somewhere in the house. He showed her ledgers stacked in careless piles, numbers that did not add correctly, entries crossed out and rewritten in a hand that was clearly not his own. "The last accountant left rather suddenly," Walter explained, not meeting her eyes. "Before that there was some trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Walter glanced toward the door before answering, as though the walls themselves might report back to someone. "Money that should have gone to the tenants never arrived. Debts that were supposed to be forgiven were collected twice. It's a mess, Miss Marsh. A dangerous sort of mess for anyone who goes digging." "Dangerous how?" He did not answer that question either. He simply handed her the first ledger and told her to start at the beginning, as if starting at the beginning might protect her from whatever waited at the end. Alina spent the rest of that day buried in numbers, and for the first time since arriving at Rothmere Hall, she felt something steady beneath her feet. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not whisper warnings and then refuse to explain them. If something was wrong in this house, the ledgers would eventually tell her what. She did not see the Duke again that day, though twice she heard his uneven footsteps pass outside the office door and pause, as if he were listening before moving on. By evening, exhausted and ink-stained, she asked Margaret a question that had been sitting in her chest since the carriage wheel broke. "What happened to him, to the Duke?" Margaret's face closed like a shutting door. "That is not your concern, Miss Marsh. People are afraid of him. I'd like to understand why, if I'm going to be living under his roof." "Fear," Margaret said quietly, "is sometimes the only sensible response to the truth. Leave it alone, for your own sake and for his." She walked away before Alina could ask anything more, leaving her standing in the corridor with more questions than she had arrived with, and a growing certainty that whatever secret Rothmere Hall was keeping, it was far bigger than a stack of crooked ledgers. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Through the tall windows, Alina could see the outline of a sealed wing at the far end of the house, its windows dark, its curtains drawn tight even in daylight, as though something inside it was still waiting, after all this time, to be let out. 3 days passed before Alina saw the Duke again, and in that time she learned more about fear than she had in her entire life before Rothmere Hall. It was not the loud kind of fear, the kind that made people scream or run. It was quiet. It lived in the way footmen changed direction in a corridor rather than pass a certain door. It lived in the way the cook, a heavy-set woman named Bridget Cole, refused to send any dish upstairs without tasting it twice first, as though she still expected to be blamed for something that had happened long before Alina arrived. Alina spent her days in the estate office with Walter Higgins, working through ledgers that grew stranger the further back she went. Entries for tenant repayments that never matched the amounts recorded in a second, hidden book she found tucked behind a loose board in the office wall. Rent collected twice from the same families in the same season. Money that left the estate accounts and simply vanished, with no destination written anywhere. "This isn't a mistake," she said to Walter one afternoon, spreading 2 ledgers side by side on the desk. "Someone did this on purpose." Walter's hands trembled as he looked at the pages. "The previous steward, Mr. Whitfield. He managed the accounts for years before the fire. After it happened, he left within a fortnight and no one has heard from him since." "The fire," Alina repeated carefully. "The one that hurt the Duke." Walter's face went pale. "I've said too much already." He would not speak of it again that day, no matter how gently she asked, and Alina was left once more with a name, Whitfield, and a fire, and no one willing to connect the two. That evening, driven by a curiosity she knew she should resist, Alina found herself walking the upstairs corridor that led toward the sealed east wing. She told herself she was only looking for a book she had misplaced. She told herself many things on that walk, none of which were entirely true. The door to the east wing was heavy, dark oak, with a lock that looked far too new for a house this old. Someone had installed it recently. Someone had gone to the trouble of making certain that whatever lay behind it stayed exactly where it was. She reached out and pressed her palm against the wood, feeling nothing but cold, when a voice behind her nearly stopped her heart. "You were told not to come here." She turned to find the Duke standing at the end of the corridor, half in shadow, the scarred side of his face turned away from the candlelight as though from habit rather than shame, though Alina suspected it was both. "I got lost," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "No one gets lost walking toward the one door in this house they've been warned about twice." His voice was not angry. It was tired, the voice of a man who had repeated the same warning so many times it had worn smooth. "What do you want, Miss Marsh?" She could have apologized and left. It would have been the wise thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that would have kept her employed and unnoticed for however long it took her to save enough money to leave this place behind. Instead, she found herself asking the question that had been building in her chest since her first night in this house. Why does everyone flinch when you walk into a room? Something shifted in his posture, a stiffening she recognized because she had seen it in her own father once, when someone had asked him about the debts that ruined their family. It was the posture of a man bracing for a blow he had decided long ago he deserved. "Because 3 years ago," he said, "there was a fire in this house. My wife did not survive it. I did, though there are nights I find that fact difficult to celebrate. The county decided I was either careless enough to have caused it, or cruel enough to have wanted it. Either version makes for excellent conversation at dinner parties I am no longer invited to." Alina did not know what to say to that, so she said the only honest thing available to her. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Sympathy is worse than fear. Fear at least keeps people at a respectful distance." He studied her for a long moment, the candlelight flickering across the uneven planes of his face. "You should learn to keep that distance yourself, Miss Marsh. It would serve you better than curiosity." With respect, my lord, I've spent the last 3 days finding evidence that someone stole money from your tenants for years and hid it well enough that no one has caught it until now. Curiosity seems to be serving your estate rather well at the moment. That earned her something she had not expected. The corner of his mouth, on the side of his face that still moved freely, twitched upward, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Elena felt an unreasonable flicker of pride at having caused it. "Show me," he said. They spent the next 2 hours in the estate office, Elena walking him through the discrepancies she had found while Walter hovered nervously near the door, clearly uncertain whether he was meant to stay or flee. The Duke listened with a sharpness that surprised her, asking precise questions, catching details even she had missed on her first pass through the numbers. "Whitfield," he said finally, tapping the hidden ledger with one scarred finger. "He managed everything after the fire. I trusted him because I trusted no one else enough to look closely at anything during that time." "Do you know where he went?" "No, and I confess I never looked, which I suspect was exactly what he was counting on." He closed the ledger and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something between gratitude and wariness, as though he had not decided yet whether trusting her would be a mistake he could afford. "Find the rest of it, Miss Marsh. Every discrepancy, every missing shilling. I want to know exactly how much was taken and from whom. And if it leads somewhere, you don't want it to lead. Then I will have finally learned something true in a house that has spent 3 years telling me nothing but comfortable lies." He left her there with the ledgers and a task that felt, for the first time since her arrival, like it might matter more than simply earning a wage. Walter waited until the sound of the Duke's uneven footsteps had faded entirely before speaking again. "You shouldn't get close to him," he said quietly. "Not because of what happened with the fire, because of what happens to people who try to help him." "What do you mean?" Walter hesitated, glancing toward the door as though expecting Margaret to appear and silence him. "The Duchess wasn't well liked, Miss Marsh, before she died. There were arguments in this house that the whole staff could hear through the walls. Some people believe the fire wasn't an accident at all. Some believe someone in this house wanted her gone and got careless about who else might be harmed in the process." Elena felt a cold settle over her that had nothing to do with the drafty office. "Are you saying the Duke set the fire?" "I'm saying I don't know what to believe, and neither does anyone else in this county. And that uncertainty is exactly why people keep their distance. It's easier to fear a man than to ask him the truth and risk what you might hear." That night, Elena lay awake long after the house had gone silent, turning Walter's words over in her mind alongside the flicker of something human she had seen cross the Duke's face in the office, the sharpness of his questions, the way he had asked her to keep looking even when the answer might implicate someone he had trusted. Guilty men, she thought, did not usually ask for the truth to be dug up. They buried it deeper. But guilty men also lied, and she had known him for exactly 4 days. It was not enough time to trust her own instincts, no matter how loudly they insisted that the fear surrounding this house was built on something other than the truth. The following days fell into a rhythm. Elena worked through the ledgers each morning with Walter, and each afternoon the Duke, whose name she learned was Alaric Voss, would appear in the office doorway to review what she had found. Their conversations grew longer with each visit, drifting occasionally away from numbers entirely. She learned that he had studied at Oxford before his father's death forced him home early. She learned that he read more than any man she had ever met, that his library, unlike the rest of the house, was warm and well used and smelled of leather and old paper rather than dust and fear. She learned, too, that he corrected her Latin without meaning to, muttering the proper conjugation under his breath when she misquoted a phrase from one of the old estate records, and then looking faintly embarrassed when he realized he had done it. "You don't have to apologize for knowing something I don't," she told him once, laughing despite herself. "It's rather refreshing, actually, Most people I've worked for pretend to know everything and are wrong about half of it. I'm not most people, he said, and there was something dry in his tone, something almost like humor, that made her wonder how long it had been since anyone in this house had made him laugh, even a little. No, she agreed, you certainly aren't. It was Margaret who noticed first. The way the Duke's visits to the office had grown longer. The way he no longer took his meals alone in his study, but occasionally appeared at the small dining table where Alina ate, sitting across from her with a book he rarely read a single page of. Margaret cornered Alina near the linen closet on the sixth day, her narrow face tight with something that looked almost like panic. You need to keep your distance from him, she said, without any greeting at all. I'm doing my job, Mrs. Doyle, nothing more. That's not what I see happening in that office every afternoon. Margaret's hands twisted the edge of her apron, a nervous habit Alina had noticed before but never understood until now. You don't know what happened in this house. You don't know what it cost the people who tried to get close to him before. Then tell me, Alina said. Everyone in this house hints at some terrible secret and then refuses to say a single clear word about it. If you're trying to protect me, Mrs. Doyle, silence isn't protection. It's just fear wearing a different coat. For a moment, Margaret looked as though she might actually answer. Her mouth opened, the words visibly gathering behind her teeth. Then something closed over her expression like a curtain falling, and she shook her head sharply. Ask him yourself if you're so determined to know. See how much you like the answer. She walked away before Alina could respond, leaving her standing alone in the corridor with the growing, uncomfortable certainty that whatever the truth of that fire was, it was going to arrive whether she was ready for it or not, and that the closer she moved to Alaric Voss, the faster that truth was coming to find her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a rider who refused to come past the front gate, as though the house itself carried some sickness he did not wish to catch. Walter brought it to the office with hands that shook worse than usual, and when Alina asked what was wrong, he only shook his head and told her it was addressed to the Duke, and that the seal on the back was one he had not seen in 3 years. Whose seal? She asked. Mr. Whitfield's, Walter said. The old steward, the one who vanished after the fire. Alina felt the same cold settle over her that she had felt the night Walter first mentioned that name. She carried the letter upstairs herself rather than trust it to a footman, and found Alaric in the library, seated near the tall windows with a book open on his knee that he had clearly stopped reading some time ago. He took the letter from her without a word, and she watched his face as he broke the seal and read it, watched the muscles along his jaw tighten with each line. When he finished, he set it down on the small table beside his chair as though it had grown too heavy to hold. What does it say? Alina asked. That Mr. Whitfield is dying, Alaric said quietly, and that before he goes, he wants to confess something to me directly, in person. He asks that I come to him within the fortnight, or he says he will take what he knows to his grave, and I will spend the rest of my life not knowing why my wife burned to death in her own bedroom. The room felt colder after that, though the fire in the hearth burned exactly as brightly as it had a moment before. Alina sat down across from him, uninvited, and for once he did not seem to mind. You'll go, she said. It was not a question. I don't know. He rubbed his scarred hand along his jaw, a habit she had noticed he fell into whenever he was thinking through something difficult. For 3 years I have told myself I already know everything I need to know about that night. I was asleep. The fire started in her room. I could not reach her in time, and I have carried the marks of trying ever since. Whitfield's confession, whatever it is, will only give the county a new reason to talk. Or it will finally give you the truth instead of rumors. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had that first night at dinner when she had refused to be afraid of him. You believe there's a difference worth chasing. I believe, Alina said carefully, that a man who set out to hide something usually keeps hiding it, especially from a dying bed. A man who wants to confess before he dies usually has something heavier on his conscience than a few stolen shillings from tenant rents. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though it might answer the question for him. "You've been in this house less than 2 weeks, Miss Marsh, and already you understand it better than people who have lived here their whole lives." "I understand numbers, my lord. People are considerably harder to add up correctly." That earned her another of his rare almost smiles, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something heavier as his gaze drifted toward the window and the darkening grounds beyond it. "I will need someone to continue the accounts while I'm away. Someone I trust not to let Whitfield's ghosts scare them out of finishing what they started." "I'm not afraid of ghosts," Elena said, "only of people pretending to be them." He left 2 days later, taking only a single manservant with him, and the house fell into a strange, unsettled quiet in his absence, as though it had been holding its breath around him, and did not quite know how to exhale now that he was gone. Elena used the time to press further into the estate records, and it was during this stretch of quiet, uninterrupted work that she began to notice things that had nothing to do with numbers at all. The groundskeeper, a heavy-set man named Neil Foss, flinched violently one afternoon when she mentioned the Duke's name in passing while asking about a boundary dispute recorded in the old land ledgers. He recovered quickly, muttering something about a sore back, but Elena had seen enough flinches in this house by now to recognize a genuine one when it happened. "Did you know the old Duchess well?" she asked him, keeping her tone light, curious rather than pointed. Neil's hand stilled on the hedge shears he had been sharpening. "Well enough to know she wasn't the woman the county liked to remember her as, after the fire made her into some tragic beauty everyone mourned. She had a temper that could strip paint off a door, and she wasn't shy about using it on anyone beneath her, staff included." "Was she cruel to the Duke as well?" Neil's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. There were shouts from that house often enough that half the village could set their clocks by them. But I'll say no more than that, Miss Marsh. I've a family to feed, and there are things in this county that get a man's position taken from him faster than a bad harvest. It was the same answer she had received a dozen times in a dozen forms since arriving at Rothmere Hall, and yet something about the way Neil said it, the fear in his voice layered over something that looked almost like old grief, told her this piece mattered more than the others. That evening, going through papers in the estate office long after Walter had gone home for the night, Elena found something tucked into the back of an old ledger that made her blood run cold. It was a letter, half burned at the edges as though someone had tried to destroy it and changed their mind partway through, or been interrupted before they could finish. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and the parts of the text that survived the fire spoke of a lover, of money moved quietly out of the estate accounts, of a plan to leave the county entirely once enough had been gathered. The letter was unsigned, but Elena did not need a signature to guess whose hand had written it. The dates matched the same period where the hidden ledger showed money vanishing from tenant accounts. The story the numbers had been trying to tell her for 2 weeks suddenly had a face attached to it. And it was not the face the county had spent 3 years pitying. She brought the letter to Margaret the next morning, uncertain who else in the house she could trust with something this fragile. Margaret's reaction told her everything before a single word was spoken. The older woman went pale, then furious, then something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight she had carried alone for years had finally found another set of shoulders to share it with. "Where did you find this?" Margaret demanded. "In the estate office, hidden in an old ledger. Mrs. Doyle, I think the Duchess was planning to leave, and I think Mr. Whitfield helped her hide the money to do it." Margaret sat down heavily in the chair beside the office door, her hands trembling around the fragile paper. "I always wondered," she said quietly, "why the fire started in her room and not his, if the county's cruel version of the story was true. I always wondered why a man who supposedly wanted his wife dead would burn himself trying to save her. You don't believe he said it? I never believed it, Margaret said, and for the first time since Alina's arrival, her voice cracked with something raw and unguarded. I have worked in this house since before he was born, Miss Marsh. I watched him grow up decent and quiet, and far too gentle for a man raised to inherit a title. I have watched 3 years of this county convict him in whispers for a crime I never once believed he committed, and I have been too much of a coward to say so out loud, because the truth I suspected was worse than the lie everyone chose to believe instead. What truth? Margaret looked up at her, and in her eyes was a grief that had clearly been waiting a very long time for permission to surface. I think the fire was meant to destroy evidence, Miss Marsh. I think someone set it to burn away exactly the kind of letter you're holding in your hand right now. Proof of theft and betrayal that would have ruined this family's name far worse than a scandal ever could. And I think the Duchess was caught inside it before whoever said it realized she hadn't left the room in time. The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with 3 years of unspoken suspicion finally given shape and weight. Whitfield, Alina said slowly. Or someone working with him. I don't know for certain, and I have no proof beyond an old woman's instinct that has been screaming the same thing since the night it happened. But His Grace has spent 3 years wearing guilt that was never his to carry, because it was easier for a grieving man to accept blame than to ask questions about a wife he'd already begun to suspect was betraying him. Alina thought of Alaric's face in the library, the exhaustion in his voice when he spoke of the fire, the careful, controlled way he held himself as though bracing permanently against a blow he had decided he deserved. She thought of Whitfield's letter, arriving now, after 3 years of silence, when a dying man's conscience had finally grown too heavy to carry into the grave. He's gone to hear Whitfield's confession, she said. Margaret's face went white, alone. With one manservant. Miss Marsh, if Whitfield is dying and finally telling the truth, he may name names that some very powerful people in this county would rather stayed buried. If His Grace arrives asking the wrong questions to the wrong ears before he's ready for what he might hear. She did not need to finish the sentence. Alina was already moving toward the door, the burned letter clutched tightly in her hand, her mind racing through the timeline of his departure, the distance to Whitfield's cottage, the 2 days that had already passed since Alaric rode out of Rothmere's gates believing he was only chasing a dying man's guilt, when in truth he might be riding directly toward the very danger that had already cost him a wife and half his face. I need a horse, she said, now. Margaret grabbed her arm before she reached the hallway, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age. You cannot go alone, Miss Marsh. If there's truth to what I fear, whoever helped Whitfield hide that theft, whoever may have set that fire, will not welcome an accountant showing up asking questions any more than they'd welcome the Duke himself. Then come with me, or send Walter, or send anyone. But I am not standing in this house waiting to find out whether he comes back from this the way he left. Something in her own voice surprised her as she said it, a fierceness she had not expected to feel for a man she had known for less than 3 weeks, a man half the county still whispered about with fear and suspicion. But she had seen the flicker of humanity behind his scars, had heard the exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 years believing the worst version of himself simply because no one had bothered to offer him another explanation. She was not going to let him ride blindly into whatever truth Whitfield was preparing to hand him, not while she held proof in her hand that could change the shape of that truth entirely. Margaret studied her for a long moment, and whatever she saw in Alina's face seemed to settle something in her own mind, because she nodded once, sharply, and released her arm. I'll send Neil with you. He knows the roads better than anyone, and he owes His Grace more than he's ever admitted out loud. She paused at the door, her expression softening into something almost like approval. You've only been here a fortnight, Miss Marsh, and already you're willing to ride into danger for a man this whole county has spent 3 years crossing the street to avoid. I hope, for both your sakes, that he's worth it." "I don't know if he's worth it," Alina said honestly, gathering her cloak and the fragile burned letter that might hold the key to 3 years of buried truth. "But I know the truth is, and he deserves to have it before anyone else decides how the story ends for him." She was on horseback within the hour, Neil riding grimly beside her, the road to Whitfield's cottage stretching out ahead of them through a countryside that had spent 3 years believing a lie, with no way of knowing whether they would arrive in time to stop that lie from claiming a second, more permanent victim. The ride to Whitfield's cottage took the better part of a day, following roads that grew narrower and rougher the further they moved from Rothmere Land, until the countryside itself seemed to close in around them like it was trying to keep them from arriving at all. Neil rode with a grim silence that told Alina he understood the danger of what they were doing better than she did, and she did not press him for conversation, saving her strength for whatever waited at the end of the journey. They arrived as the light was beginning to fail, the cottage a low, sagging building at the edge of a small village Alina had never heard of, smoke curling from its chimney in a thin gray line against the darkening sky. Alaric's horse was tied outside, and beside it, a second horse she did not recognize, its saddle finer than anything a dying steward's household should have been able to afford. "That's not His Grace's manservant's mount," Neil said quietly, dismounting fast. "That's a gentleman's horse." They approached the cottage carefully, and it was Neil who first heard the raised voices through the thin walls, gesturing for Alina to stay back as he crept closer to the shuttered window. She ignored him, moving to his side despite the warning in his eyes, and together they listened to a conversation that turned Alina's blood to ice. "You will not say another word to him," a voice was saying, cultured, cold, a voice that carried the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life feared consequences. "You've had 3 years to keep your silence, Whitfield. A dying conscience is a poor excuse for undoing everything I paid you to bury." "He deserves to know the truth," came a second voice, weaker, rattling with the particular exhaustion of a man near the end of his life. "I've carried it long enough, longer than any man should carry a thing like this. You'll carry it into your grave, or I will make certain you arrive there considerably sooner than nature intended." Alina's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned to find Alaric's face through a gap in the shutters, standing near the dying man's bed, his posture rigid, his hand resting near his coat in a way that suggested he had already sensed the danger in the room even before the threat had been spoken aloud. "Who are you?" Alaric said, and his voice, even through the thin wall, carried a controlled fury Alina had not heard from him before. The cultured voice laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Does it matter? I am the man who kept your family's name from ruin, Your Grace, whether you thank me for it or not. Your wife had expensive tastes and even more expensive company. The money she and Whitfield here moved out of your accounts would have exposed a scandal far worse than a house fire. I simply made certain the evidence burned along with the room she died in." The silence that followed was so complete that Alina could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. "You set the fire," Alaric said, each word coming out slow and terrible, like stones dropped one at a time into still water. "I set a fire meant to destroy a stack of letters and a false ledger before they could ruin your family's name," the man corrected, his tone almost bored, as though he were discussing an unremarkable business transaction rather than a death. "Your wife was not meant to still be in the room. She was meant to be halfway to London with her lover by the time the flames caught. She changed her plans at the last moment and did not think to inform me. Her death was an unfortunate complication, not an intention." "An unfortunate complication," Alaric repeated, and Alina had never heard a voice carry so much restrained violence in 5 simple words. "You have spent 3 years believing yourself responsible," the man continued. "I confess I found that rather convenient. A grieving, guilty duke asks far fewer questions than an angry one." Neil was already moving toward the door, and Alina followed a half-step behind, her heart hammering, the burned letter still clutched in her coat pocket like it might somehow shield her from whatever was about to happen inside that cottage. They burst through the door together, and the scene that met them was frozen for one suspended heartbeat. Alaric standing near the bed, where a wasted, gray-faced Whitfield lay propped against thin pillows, and between them, a well-dressed man Alina did not recognize, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade at his belt, his composed expression cracking for the first time at the sight of two unexpected arrivals. "Lord Ashcombe," Neil said, and there was real shock in his voice. "The county magistrate." The name landed like a physical blow. Alina understood in an instant why no one in 3 years had dared to question the official verdict on the fire, why the investigation had closed so quickly, why Whitfield's disappearance had never been properly pursued. The man responsible for enforcing justice in this county was the very man who had set the fire in the first place, and had spent 3 years making certain no one looked closely enough to find him. Ashcombe's hand tightened on his blade. "This does complicate things rather more than I'd hoped." "Put it down," Alaric said, stepping between the magistrate and the dying man's bed, his voice steady despite everything Alina knew must be tearing through him in that moment. "You've done enough killing in this county pretending to serve justice, Ashcombe. I won't let you add 2 more names to that list tonight." "2 more," Ashcombe repeated, his eyes flicking toward Alina and Neil in the doorway, calculation moving visibly behind his gaze as he weighed his remaining options. "You misunderstand the situation, Your Grace. I have no wish to harm anyone. I simply require silence, and I am prepared to be generous in exchange for it." "I don't want your money," Alaric said. "Then perhaps you prefer your sister's reputation intact instead," Ashcombe said, and something in his voice turned suddenly sharper, more dangerous. "Because if this story becomes public, it will not stop at my involvement, Your Grace. Your wife's affair, her theft, the truth of what kind of household you were actually running here, all of it comes out alongside my name. Your sister is set to marry into a respectable family next season. How well do you imagine that arrangement survives a scandal this size?" Alina watched something shift across Alaric's face, the same bracing posture she had seen the night he told her about the fire. A man once again preparing to accept blame that was not entirely his to carry, this time to protect someone else from a truth that threatened to ruin them. "You would use my sister to buy your own silence," Alaric said quietly. "I would use whatever proves effective," Ashcombe replied. "I find sentiment makes people remarkably easy to manage." It was Whitfield from his bed who spoke next, his voice thin but suddenly steady in a way it had not been throughout the entire exchange. "I am dying, my Lord Ashcombe. There is nothing left you can threaten me with that frightens me more than facing my Maker with this lie still on my conscience. I wrote a full confession 3 days ago and sent it by messenger to the county assizes, to arrive should I pass before His Grace came to hear it from my own mouth. Whatever you do to any of us in this room tonight, the truth is already beyond your reach." The color drained from Ashcombe's face entirely. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds that felt to Alina to stretch on for much longer. Ashcombe lunged, not toward Alaric, but toward the door, toward escape, and Neil moved to block him with the solid, immovable bulk of a man who had spent decades working land with his hands. The two collided hard enough to shake the thin cottage walls, and in the struggle that followed, it was Alaric, moving faster than his stiff, scarred hand should have allowed, who caught Ashcombe's wrist and forced the blade from his grip before it could find a target. It was over almost as quickly as it began. Ashcombe, disarmed and outnumbered, slumped against the wall with the particular defeat of a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that no one would ever dare challenge him, only to discover, too late, that he had finally run out of people willing to stay silent. Neil held him pinned, while Alina found rope in the small cottage kitchen, and by the time they had him secured well enough to be delivered to a magistrate from the neighboring county, one who had no history of buried secrets in Rothmere's fires, The adrenaline that had carried Alina through the entire ride and confrontation finally began to drain out of her, leaving her shaking in its place. Alaric found her sitting outside the cottage door a few minutes later, staring at her own trembling hands as though they belonged to someone else. "You shouldn't have come," he said, but there was no real reprimand in his voice, only something raw and unguarded that she had not heard from him before. "You shouldn't have come alone," she countered. He sat down beside her on the cottage step, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold night air settling around them. 3 years, he said quietly. I believed I killed her. 3 years I let this county look at me like a monster because it was easier than asking the questions that might have led here instead. You didn't kill her, Alina said, and you're not a monster, you never were. You didn't know that before tonight. I knew it before tonight, she said. I've known it since the first night I sat at your table, and you looked more relieved than angry that someone in this house had finally stopped flinching at the sight of you. He turned to look at her then, and in the pale moonlight, the scarred side of his face no longer looked like something to hide. It looked like proof of a man who had tried and failed and kept trying anyway, and Alina found she could not look away from it, not because she was brave, but because there was simply nothing there that frightened her anymore. What happens now? She asked. Now, Alaric said, I go home and I tell my sister the truth before Ashcombe's allies find some way to twist it first. And I stop letting this county decide what kind of man I am, based on a lie a corrupt magistrate built out of my own grief. And Whitfield. They both looked back toward the small window where the dying steward lay quiet now, his confession finally spoken aloud to the one man who most needed to hear it. He'll answer for what he did, Alaric said. But not tonight. Tonight, I think, he's earned a little peace before the reckoning comes. Alina nodded, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the cold, saying nothing at all. Two people who had arrived at this cottage from very different directions and found, somehow, that the truth had brought them closer rather than tearing them apart. Thank you, Alaric said finally, for not staying safely behind at the house. I told you, Alina said. I've never been much good at being told what to fear. He almost smiled at that, the real kind this time, small and tired but genuine, and Alina thought, watching it, that whatever waited for them back at Rothmere Hall, whatever scandal and reckoning was still to come, she was glad, without a single doubt left in her mind, that she had risked the ride to be beside him for this. The journey back to Rothmere Hall took 2 full days, and Alina spent much of it watching Alaric ride ahead of her, his shoulders set with a steadiness that had not been there before, as though the truth, however painful, had loosened some knot inside him that 3 years of guilt had tied tight. Neil rode a little behind, keeping watch, his manner toward Alaric noticeably softer than it had been at the start of the journey, as though the events at the cottage had settled something in him too. Whitfield's written confession, sent ahead by messenger before their arrival, had already begun to reach the county assizes by the time they crossed back onto Rothmere land, and word of it moved faster than any of them could travel. By the second evening, the neighboring magistrate's office had dispatched officers to take custody of Ashcombe from the small village lockup where Neil and Alaric had left him, and the story of a corrupt county official finally facing justice for a crime hidden for 3 years was already beginning to spread from village to village like fire through dry summer grass, an irony Alina did not miss. Rothmere Hall itself felt different when they finally rode through its gates. The staff gathered in the courtyard as word spread that His Grace had returned, and Alina watched something remarkable happen in the faces of people who had spent 3 years flinching at the sight of him. Bridget Cole, the cook, was openly weeping. Walter Higgins stood near the office door with an expression of such profound relief that he looked 10 years younger than he had a week before. Even Margaret Doyle, usually so composed, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth as Alaric dismounted, and for the first time since Alina's arrival, She saw the housekeeper's carefully guarded control crack entirely. "You'll want to speak with Lady Voss before anyone else does," Margaret said quietly to Alaric, once the initial commotion had settled. "News like this travels faster than kindness allows, Your Grace. Better she hears the truth from you than from a gossip in the village." Alaric's sister, Charlotte, was 17 and had spent the past 3 years largely sheltered from the worst of the county's whispers, kept close to the estate and away from society gatherings where cruel tongues might have found their mark. She met her brother in the entrance hall with the particular wariness of someone who has learned to read bad news in a person's posture before a single word is spoken. "What's happened?" she asked immediately. Alaric led her into the library, and though Elena was not present for that conversation, she learned later from Margaret that he had told his sister everything, holding nothing back. Not the theft, not the affair, not the truth of how their sister-in-law had died, nor the corrupt magistrate who had built 3 years of lies on top of a grieving man's silence. Charlotte emerged from that library an hour later with red eyes but a steady chin, and when she passed Elena in the corridor, she stopped and studied her for a long moment with an expression far too perceptive for a girl of 17. "My brother tells me you rode into danger to bring him proof of the truth," Charlotte said. "That you and a groundskeeper stopped a corrupt magistrate from silencing a dying man's confession." "I only did what seemed necessary at the time," Elena said, uncertain how to respond to the frank appraisal in the younger woman's gaze. "He has not looked this much like himself in 3 years," Charlotte said quietly. "Whatever you did, Miss Marsh, I find I am considerably more grateful for it than frightened of the scandal it's about to unleash on this family's name." The scandal, when it broke fully across the county in the days that followed, was every bit as significant as Ashcombe had warned it would be. The story of the Duchess's affair and theft spread alongside the story of her death and the corrupt magistrate who had covered it up. And for a week, Rothmere Hall found itself the subject of exactly the kind of attention it had spent 3 years desperately avoiding. But it was a different kind of attention than before. Where once the county had whispered about a duke who might have murdered his own wife, now they whispered about a duke who had been wrongly blamed for 3 years, while the true architect of the tragedy walked free in a position of power, protected by exactly the kind of authority that should have exposed him instead. Sympathy, Elena noted with some private irony, arrived far too late to undo the damage 3 years of fear had already done, but it arrived nonetheless, and slowly, cautiously, the servants of Rothmere Hall began to relax in ways Elena had not witnessed since her arrival. Bridget stopped tasting every dish twice before sending it upstairs. The maids no longer dropped their eyes to the floor when Alaric passed. Neil, in particular, seemed to walk a little taller around the estate, as though some old debt of guilt he had privately carried, perhaps for suspecting his master and saying nothing, had finally been settled. It was Elena who found the courage, nearly 2 weeks after their return from Whitfield's cottage, to raise the subject of the East Wing. She found Alaric in the library one evening, a book open on his knee that he was, for once, actually reading, the firelight catching the strong line of his jaw and the scarred side of his face without either of them flinching from the sight of it. "The East Wing," she said, sitting across from him as she had grown accustomed to doing over the past weeks. "It's still sealed." He set the book aside. "I haven't been able to go in there since it happened. I told myself it was practical, that there was nothing left in those rooms worth salvaging after the fire. The truth is simpler than that. I was afraid of what I might feel, standing in the place she died, now that I know she was planning to leave me for another man before the flames ever took the choice from either of us." "You don't have to go in alone," Elena said. He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded and searching in his expression. "You would go in with me, into a room where a woman died, a woman who by all accounts did not deserve to be mourned as gently as this county mourned her for 3 years. "I would go with you," Elena said simply, "because I think that room has become a kind of prison for this entire house, not just for her memory, and I think it's time someone helped you open the door instead of walking past it." They went the following afternoon, Margaret accompanying them with a key that had clearly sat untouched in her apron pocket for a very long time. The lock turned with a stiff, reluctant groan, and the door swung open onto a room preserved in the exact moment tragedy had frozen it. Scorched furniture still standing where fire and smoke had left it. Curtains reduced to blackened scraps still hanging from their rods. A room that had been sealed away rather than faced. Alaric stood in the doorway for a long moment, his breathing controlled but visibly effortful, and Alina stayed beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm, close enough that he would know, without needing to say it, that he did not have to face this alone. "I keep expecting to feel something enormous," he said quietly. "Grief, or anger, or forgiveness. Instead, I mostly feel tired and a little bit relieved that it's finally just a room and not a mystery anymore." "Grief doesn't always arrive on schedule," Alina said. "Sometimes it just needs the door open before it knows it's allowed to leave." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from the guarded, careful man she had met on her first night at Rothmere Hall, dining alone in a house too large and too frightened to hold him properly. "You've made this house bearable again, Miss Marsh. I'm not entirely certain how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me," Alina said. "I only came here to balance your ledgers, my lord. Everything else was simply refusing to look away when everyone else insisted on it." "Perhaps," Alaric said, "that's precisely why it mattered." Margaret, standing quietly near the doorway, cleared her throat with the particular delicacy of a woman who has decided a private moment has stretched long enough to require interruption. "Shall I have the staff begin clearing this room, Your Grace? It's long past time this wing rejoined the rest of the house." "Yes," Alaric said, still looking at Alina rather than the ruined room around them. "Open every window. Let it air out properly. This house has spent 3 years being a tomb. I think it's earned the chance to be a home again." Word of the changes at Rothmere Hall spread through the county almost as quickly as the scandal itself had. Neighbors who had crossed the street rather than acknowledge the Duke on market days began, cautiously at first, to offer greetings again. Invitations, long withheld, began arriving at the estate for the first time in 3 years, though Alaric accepted few of them, seeming, for now, more interested in rebuilding the quiet foundations of his own household than in reclaiming his standing in county society. Alina remained at Rothmere Hall long after the ledgers had been fully corrected and the tenant debts properly resolved, a fact that Walter noted with a knowing, gentle smile whenever the subject of her continued employment arose. She told herself in the early weeks that she stayed because there was still work to be done, records to maintain, a household still finding its footing after 3 years of fear and neglect. She stopped telling herself that particular lie the evening Alaric found her in the garden at dusk, the ruined east wing behind them finally stripped of its blackened curtains and thrown open to fresh air for the first time in 3 years, its windows catching the last of the sunset like something newly alive rather than something long dead. "The county magistrate's office sent word today," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Ashcombe's trial has been scheduled. Whitfield, I'm told, is not expected to live long enough to testify in person, but his written confession will stand regardless." "Justice, however late," Alina said. "However late," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, watching the same sunset she had been watching, before he spoke again, his voice carrying a rare uncertainty she had not heard from him since the night at Whitfield's cottage. "Charlotte tells me I should ask you to stay on permanently, in whatever capacity would convince you to remain." Alina turned to look at him, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. "And what capacity did you have in mind, my lord?" "I confess I have not entirely worked that out," Alaric said, and there was something almost boyish in the admission, a lightness she had never once heard in his voice during her first weeks in this house. "I only know that this house, and I, along with it, have become considerably more livable since you refuse to be afraid of either of us, and I find I am no longer interested in discovering what either of us becomes again if you leave." "Then perhaps," Alina said, stepping closer, close enough now that neither of them needed to raise their voice above the quiet evening air, "we should work it out together and see what capacity fits, rather than deciding it alone." He reached out, his scarred hand finding hers with a gentleness that spoke louder than any words he might have chosen instead. And for the first time in 3 years, standing in the shadow of a house that had finally stopped being a tomb, Alaric Voss did not look away from anyone watching, and no one in Rothmere Hall looked away from him either. The county would talk for months about the scandal that had finally exposed a corrupt magistrate and cleared a wrongly blamed duke's name, and much of that talk would eventually fade, as county gossip always does, into some other scandal, some other story to fill quiet evenings by the fire. But inside Rothmere Hall itself, something quieter and more permanent had taken root, built not on fear or rumor, but on a woman who had walked through rain and mud on her very first night and decided, without any particular reason to, that she was simply not going to be afraid of a man everyone else had been too frightened to know. And in the end, that single, stubborn refusal to look away was the thing that finally let the whole house breathe again.